are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is the Little Red Riding Hood murder. Now, there's nothing more terrifying to a mother than a missing child, and there's nothing more terrifying to an innocent child than a scary story, and unfortunately, this case has the element of both. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, so if you would like to support me, all you have to do is subscribe and watch these videos. I want to give a huge thank you to the Nothing Rhymes with Murder podcast for giving me some of this information in this case. They're absolutely brilliant. I loved listening to them, and I will definitely be listening more in the future, but check them out down below in the link if you want to listen to them. Now let's get into the story. So it was 1946 in Wales, and Muriel Joan Drinkwater was a 12-year-old girl who lived with her family, and her parents' names were Margaret and Joan, and she was the youngest of 4 girls. Now, Muriel was an adorable little girl who was often called Nightingale because she would go around singing so often, and to me she seemed like a happy-go-lucky, innocent little thing, which breaks my heart because she deserved a life that she would love, and it was taken from her before she could even get to be a teenager. Muriel was a member of the Nightingale Patrol of the Girls Guides, which was basically a club that would look good on applications for university, which she was certain that she was going to go to. She would go to Sunday school every single week and get wonderful grades at the local grammar school named Pimslaugar. But on June 28th, 1946, her body would be found in the woods by her house, and she had been sexually assaulted, shot twice in the chest, and beaten in the head. She had gone missing just the day prior on the 27th. It was a school day, and she rode the bus home, except for the bus didn't always stop close to her house because you did kind of have to go through some woods to get there. So she had a mile walk home that she would take pretty regularly, and she would get off the bus at around 2:30 p.m. and head down this kind of woodsy area. It was a path that she always went through. It curved in and out of the woods to where she could see her house, then would go into the thick brush where she couldn't see anything, then back out to her house, and she would often sing while doing this. Through the window of their family home, which was the Tildew farm, her mother looked out and saw Muriel walking home. They waved at each other, and Muriel's mother felt that anxiety that all mothers get while they're waiting for their children to come home. It just vanished. She had seen her, so she went back to doing her own work and figured Muriel would walk through the door at any moment, except for time passed, and the amount of time that it would have taken her from the spot her mother saw her to the front door was long gone, and she was still not there yet. At this point, the anxiety rose again, and her mother decided to go through the woods, then go down to the village because they were a little bit outside of town, to search around to ask people if they had seen her, and when nobody did, she contacted the police. At this point, it was already beginning to get dark. However, the search team assembled and they went searching through the woods that she'd been last seen in, and even though it was very hard to see, they continued searching, hoping that they would find something. And that is when they did, and something that is a very tough thing to handle in this investigation, or in any investigation, and that is rain. When you're searching outside for somebody, you know, the evidence can be washed away. It's hard to see in the rain, and this is just something that ultimately hindered this case. This is when a 13-year-old came forward saying that he was possibly the last person to have seen Muriel, and that was because he had walked through the same path to the Tildew farm to get butter and eggs, which the Drinkwater family often sold to people of the village if they would come up to the farm, and his name was Herbert Hoyles, and like I said, he was 13 years old, and he was walking back from the farm, so in the opposite direction of Muriel, but he said that he came in contact with her, and they exchanged a hello, but they didn't stop to talk, and they just continued on their separate ways. But Herbert and Muriel had gone to primary school together, actually. They were around the same age, and they had separated once they went to grammar school and really hadn't seen each other since then, and it's not like they were super close friends, just acquaintances, so they didn't really talk much. The search lasted through the night with no good news coming the Drinkwaters' way until the light would come again, and it would be 10:30 a.m. when something was finally found. And it was just a few minutes from the family farm when a blue school coat and red gloves would be seen, and upon further inspection, it was Muriel laying on her back with one arm outstretched by her side and the other one raised slightly, and she was still wearing her school uniform. At this point, the police inspector said about the crime scene, "It was like something out of a nightmare. Like the Little Red Riding Hood, but with a terrible ending." Now, the Scotland Yard was called in to help search at this point because it was such a huge case, and nearly 2,000 men in the surrounding areas were questioned and houses were searched, and the media coverage was just as huge, which ended up being possibly the reason why 3,000 people attended her funeral at St. David's Church. Now, 2 days later, the murder weapon would be found as well. It was not too far from Muriel's body, and it was a World War I era Colt 45, and it also had a unique custom butt to it, a checkered pattern perspex grip. And the investigators also believed that there was another murder weapon as well that was possibly used on Muriel, and they searched the area with metal detectors. However, they couldn't find anything else. At this point, because this was the only evidence they had in this murder, they put the picture of this gun everywhere, including on the screens in cinemas, because it did appear to be a similar weapon used in a murder of a cinema manager in Bristol, and so they were hoping that maybe someone who went there or knew something about that murder could help in this murder. And they had also found that it had been made in a Springfield armory in 1942, which was 4 years prior to the murder, and shipped to the U.S. forces in Europe. Unfortunately, there was no record made of which soldier had actually gotten this gun, who it belonged to, and it could have traveled through many different hands throughout the years. And then that is when Scotland Yard asked the United States for help. And they had known that many Americans had been stationed around this exact location during the Second World War, which is how the gun could have gotten there. And it could have been being used by a soldier or somebody the soldier had given the gun to or sold the gun to, and so they turned to the United States for help. A few years later, with this case still unsolved and having no idea who a suspect even could be, that the same boy who had been the last one to see Muriel would come forward again, Herbert. And he would say that he had taken that exact path that Muriel had many different times to go get butter and eggs from the Drinkwaters, and that one afternoon a few weeks prior to Muriel's murder, he was going through when a man kind of came out of nowhere, out of the bushes, and approached him, and it kind of scared him a little bit. Herbert said he was smartly dressed. He was in his 30s, and he asked Herbert what he was doing there. When Herbert said that he was just going to get some eggs, the man appeared agitated, but then told him to get on his way and didn't disrupt him any further. Herbert said that he had a local accent, and also he had a menacing presence. Now, Herbert said he took that path for many years and never saw anyone on it really but this guy, and he never saw that guy ever again. Now, from Herbert's statement, the police could get a description of this possible suspect, and it was a 30-year-old man with thick fluffy hair wearing a brown corduroy trousers and a light brown sports jacket. Now, unfortunately, even with this case was unsolved and cold for many years until 2003, when they decided to reopen it to hopefully work with more DNA evidence now that they had the better technology, and they were going to test the gun for fingerprints or DNA. However, when they got it, they realized that so many people had handled it throughout the years that they couldn't test it for anyone. And they also realized that Muriel's clothing that she had worn that day were missing, so they couldn't test those either. However, 5 years later, retired detectives who were looking into different cold cases in the area, they were going through a storage unit when they found her clothes in a paper bag, and it had her blue coat, her underwear, and her school uniform. And on the jacket, it actually had a yellow circle around it, which is what they used to kind of mark out where the semen stain was. The semen stain was no longer visible, but they did still have that marking, and they tested it, and they actually found a DNA profile, except for it didn't match anyone in the databases at this time. For many years after Muriel had been murdered, the 13-year-old Herbert, he had so many people theorize that it was him. People often thought that because he was the last one to see her, that he took so many years to come forward with a strange man description, that all of that was a lie and that he had done something. And so he could officially give them DNA, and he wanted to. He willingly gave up his DNA and said, please test it so people know that it's not me. He said, it was a heck of a shock for the village, a terrible time. I never went up that track again in my life. I wouldn't go back there. And he was completely cleared as a suspect. However, a year later, they would have a new one, and that was because when they were looking at different cases in the area at the time, they found that there was another unsolved murder that happened 10 days after Muriel's, and it was of an 11-year-old girl. It was Sheila Martin, who was 250 miles away in Sun Hill Wood, Fockham Green, Kent. And Sheila was sexually assaulted and strangled in the woods half a mile from her home. Her murder had never been solved either, and they weren't 100% sure that Muriel and Sheila's murders were connected. However, if they were, there was a theory on who had done it. A huge theory was brought forward by a crime author named Neil Milkins, who said he believed that murderer Harold Jones had done it to both of these girls. Now, he was a child murderer who murdered 2 girls in 1921 in Albert Tillery when he was just 15. These murders varied slightly, just like Muriel and Sheila's, however they were just as aggressive, and he was released from prison for those murders in 1941, 5 years prior to these girls. This theory was believed by many, and they had so much hope that these cases were connected and that it was Harold Jones. End of story. They had a suspect. They had someone to blame. However, in 2019, there was an update in this case, and South Wales police confirmed that Harold Jones was not responsible for the murder of Muriel Drinkwater because the forensic tests on her coat with the semen were officially tested and able to rule him out. Now, Muriel's great niece at this point has said, we realize whoever did this might be dead, but if he is alive and in the 80s or even in his 90s, we would like to see him behind bars. The murder turned our family upside down and has been talked about through the generations. This was a terrible, terrible crime that someone has got away with for too long. Now, both Muriel and Sheila's cases have been unsolved, and if you have any information about Muriel's murder or what happened to her, please contact South Wales Police via this email. But who do you think murdered Muriel? Was it a serial killer in the area? Was it meant to be Muriel exactly? Or I had a theory when I was researching that there were so many Americans in the area during the war. If this was an American gun, a creepy man worried about what people were doing on this path, could this have been a soldier suffering from PTSD? PTSD, especially back then, was probably very horrible because nobody really knew that much about it, I don't think, back then, because we don't really know much about it now. Could this have been a soldier that was like left behind or got lost or went back after the fact and was triggered by something at that time? Maybe it was Muriel's singing that he just got outraged about and killed her, or maybe just her being there in his presence. Maybe he thought of her as a threat, because I've often read about soldiers that can be triggered by such a little thing to put them back in a situation like they're in the war, and they can instantly go back in that in their mind and not realize that what's happening in front of them is completely different and they are causing harm to somebody that was never going to cause harm to them. I mean, maybe she was just singing and he was having some sort of PTSD flashback and he got outraged with her that she was singing and wanted to make her stop. I'm not saying that this makes it an excuse for what he did, but it is a possibility that something like this could happen. And the only thing that I think makes this hard to believe is the sexual assault. If Muriel was sexually assaulted, that's not something really that somebody in a PTS flashback would do, because that wouldn't have anything to do with it unless there was another reason why he would have done that. But I just can't think if he thought he was fighting for his life, why he would do that as well. So that does kind of make me lean more towards that this was a serial killer or someone who was attacking her personally, knew the family, possibly took that trail many times to get milk and eggs just like Hubert. I really don't think he has anything to do with it. He was ruled out DNA wise, but I never thought from the beginning he did. And this one frustrates me the most because her mother saw her and knew, okay, she's safe, she's coming home, and then just in a few minutes she was murdered right next to her house. It makes no sense that nobody heard, and if this was an experienced killer, why was the murder weapon left at the crime scene? It doesn't make any sense. Even if it wasn't theirs and they had found it from this soldier or just found it laying around, why wouldn't you just take it with you? But I did want to ask, would any of you like to see a full case on the child killer Harold Jones, who was a suspect in this case at one point? He was ruled out of this case, however. His case is just as creepy and fascinating, so if you'd like me to do that, give this a thumbs up and maybe let me know down below. And don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Bye!